Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ramiro from ANTICONQUISTA. ANTICONQUISTA is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And today we got a special treat for y'all. We're talking about 2020, crazy ass fucking year. A lot of shit has happened this year. But we've also used that as a chance as ANTICONQUISTA to grow, to develop, to serve our people, to educate our people. And we're going to be just talking shop today about major events that happened in Latin America and the Caribbean, across the world, and how it impacts our people. And today we have the leadership, the squad that makes ANTICONQUISTA happen on the day-to-day, the co-editor team, including myself, Ofelia Carrillo, Carlos Cruz Mosquera in London, Nick. Unfortunately, Comrade Rich was not able to join, but shout out to Comrade Rich as well, who holds it down with designs, with the website, and always puts in work with the merch shop as well. Please make sure to go and share this. I know this is kind of on a whim and random, but we decided to just talk about the year. I think that it was a year that so much should happen, and we want to take time to just kind of reflect on everything that happened with all the co-editors. So before we get into talking about some of the major events, I kind of just want to go around and ask everybody here on the stream. This is something actually that me and Ofelia talk about all the time, that especially with COVID-19, what's one lesson that you've learned this year, whether it's for yourself or the world or in general, that this year has taught you? Because this year has taught me a lot personally. For me, it's taught me to value and care for those who care for me. And has shown me the importance of who's really important in my life, who's not, and what things are important. But I don't know if you guys want to share anything personal that this year has taught you.
You have anything, Nick?
I mean, one thing I've been telling comrades I've been working with here is, I learned a lot from BLM protests that happened in May and all throughout the summer here, and not only just the U.S. but throughout the world. And I think I learned a lot from just tactics that were used to by the bourgeois class to co-opt and control a lot of the protests that were going on here. Especially when you look at like how those protests transformed into what later occurred in the U.S. elections, which was a lot of that energy and that movement was kind of transferred right back into liberal politics. And a lot of people who are big in the movement helped in that transfer. A lot of people who were, senior names in that movement helped in that transfer. So, I think a big takeaway is how we can better grow our movements, who we can rely on, who can we trust, kind of like what Ramiro was talking about, but more on a movement basis,
So anybody else?
Also on my part, this year's is the year, especially because of COVID, where I was raised going to protest by my parents. It was like a very important thing, going to protests and stuff, and like physically being there, and not being able to physically be there. We kind of have to adapt, and it's made me think more and more. I wrote an article on it for ANTICONQUISTA, more and more the importance of activism online, not feeling guilty of not being able to go to physical protests. And especially when it comes to international issues, when it comes to situation back home, of course, protests help. Street activism helps in our local communities where we are. But when it comes to challenging imperialism, say, or if we're interested in the international struggle, especially back home, I think online is becoming more and more the platform, the place where the struggle is for us as the diaspora. So yeah, I'd say that's my thing.
I would say this year has really been reaffirming in so many ways, not just personal, but I think especially in our ideological perspective as third worldists, every election year, it's really interesting to see what happens in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the third world. And oftentimes when there's chaos and conflict and difficulty in the imperial core, we find that our homelands have just space to breathe, right? Like there's a rise in protests. There's also a rise in like progressive governments coming back to power, because the warmongers are so preoccupied with shoring things up at home. Wide internal contradictions here, especially in the US, that Latin America and the Caribbean has a bit more space, I would say. And I think that to me like reinforces like why I'm a third worldist, like why like we're specifically from that perspective at Anticonquista, like why things we were more timid about maybe in May when the George Floyd protests took off, like criticizing BLM. Now it's just right in your face, things that we were kind of like, well, obviously we're never going to say don't go out and protest, but at the same time, like question the authenticity of what those protests are asking for and what they're trying to do. And now I was just reading, like similar to what Nick said, I was just reading an article in Politico about BLM where they were saying that they started a 501c4, so it's like a political action committee. They're one of the founders like is made herself the ED without seeking consensus from all the BLM chapters that are in the country. And the fucked up part was that Politico was kind of like, oh well, this is because what is it, like everything is like decentralized, and that's just kind of like how organizing and protesting works. I'm like, yeah, here everywhere else it's like more disciplined and structured and has organization, and that's because a lot of it is Marxist-Leninist, like a lot of it is dialectical, and that is what's lacking in this country, right? When you look at mass organized protests, why these movements fall apart so quickly, because there is no ideological base to a lot of these. It's a conglomerate of like, not that they don't have legitimate, grievances or things that need to be changed in this country, but I think that for me was really interesting about this year, along with everything coronavirus kind of already amplified, things we've been saying about healthcare, things we've been saying about imperialism. I think those contradictions kind of came to a head, but to me that was what was the most interesting this year.
Yeah, definitely. And before we get into, obviously COVID-19 is gonna is a big part of this year. I mean, I think 2020 is probably going to go down in history as like the year of the plague or whatever, of COVID. We'll get into that in a second. By the way, shout out to everybody in the chat. Shout out to Edith Machuca in LA. Shout out to Howard Saldana in LA as well. Shout out to James Graham in Scotland. Anthony Penza. Shout out to Thomas Ketchum in London. Shout out to everybody who's on here and listening to the podcast as well. And also, if you have any comments or any topics that you want us to talk about from 2020, please go and put those on the chat and let us know, and we'll try to keep track of them. We have a few things we want to talk about from the year that we think are pretty interesting and important. One of them, almost a year ago, if you all remember, it seems like years ago, but it was almost just a year ago, Trump declared war on Iran. Basically, he killed General Soleimani in Iraq, and he was the head of the Iranian Al-Quds force, and basically almost started World War III. Trump is someone we know who's backed by Israel, the Zionist lobby, and the right wing in the US trying to start new wars. What'd you all think about that? I mean, that it's just crazy. And I know people will say like, oh, well, Iran's not in Latin America and the Caribbean. Like, what does that have to do with it? But we have to remember that because of Iran's solidarity with Venezuela, Venezuela is able to help keep up its economy. It's building international solidarity with Nicaragua, with Cuba, with the Latin American left. What do you guys think about that? I know a lot of us were doing content around Iran, but where do you see the U.S. war with Iran now?
So I guess one of the things I remember being out there in the protest here in New York, protesting like war, no more war against Iran, no more sanctions. And you talk about what happened about a year ago. Right now, that looks like Donald Trump is trying to do the same thing. He's applying more pressure against Iran. I think one of the things that my administration said they're going to apply more sanctions every week until Trump leaves office on Iran, just to mess with Joe Biden and his ability to get back into the nuclear deal. I remember doing, I think about a month ago, we did a press TV interview with talking about how the Iran nuclear deal, if the U.S. is going to get back in, what's going to happen. And I think what we're going to see is, the U.S. really, the Republicans and the Democrats are going to have the same strategy against Iran, which is regime change, until the corporatists can get their way. So any sort of deal right now with Iran that might benefit Iran is not going to be okay with the U.S. It's not going to be okay with Joe Biden. It's not going to be okay with Donald Trump. So, if they see right now that Iran is benefiting from the nuclear deal because they actually upheld their part of the deal and the U.S. backed out, which right now is actually benefiting Iran, then the U.S. isn't going to get back into it, and the U.S. isn't going to try to do anything or go into a deal that's going to be advantageous towards the other side. So, I think that war is just going to keep getting ramped up, and all that talk about pushing Biden left to be back into the nuclear deal is all going to be a bunch of progressive BS like before. It's just going to get more serious from here.
Cool. Anybody else? I'm writing down questions. You already have some great questions in the chat. But any other thoughts about the U.S. war on Iran?
Yeah, I would also add that, when that shit was happening earlier in the year, we wrote a few pieces, and the Western left weren't happy with what we were saying. The communists, the Western communists weren't happy with what we were saying because to them, the Iran isn't a socialist or communist country, so they don't deserve our support. And, it could just go. They can be attacked by the U.S. and it doesn't matter because they're not socialists or communists. And of course, that's not our line. It isn't our thinking. We know because of our experiences in the regions where we're from. In the region we're from, that our struggle is not just a class struggle, but a struggle for independence, for sovereignty, and so on. So even though Iran is not a socialist or a communist country exactly, we have to show support, and even if that means that the Western left is gonna criticize us, and we have to. It's a duty that we have.
And on top of that, Iran is the country that filled Venezuela's grocery store shelves during the pandemic because of the sanctions the U.S. also levied against Venezuela. They brought in a oil tanker, to support domestic production in Venezuela. These things are not talked about in the news, are not talked about by the first world left, right? Because we care about who's feeding our people. We care about, creating an alternative, basically, to capitalism and imperialism. And Iran has done that consistently, right? And it's something that is not missed by most third worldists, by us, by Anticonquista, by the people of Venezuela, and I think that that's also important to note, that Iran has, despite its incredible limitations, has always stood in solidarity with our people. And I think it's reciprocated, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. And it's I'm glad you all mentioned that, because it's we held strong in our line. People hit us up and we're like, how dare you guys, all this shit. And we held strong. We're like, nah, countries have a right to self-determination. It's up to countries under attack by imperialism to decide how they want to liberate themselves. And more people, I think, are coming along with understanding that it's important for countries like Iran to respect Iran, regardless of whatever disagreements we have on secondary issues, to defend their sovereignty. So moving forward into the year, obviously one of the major events of the year was COVID-19 on March. It's something that in China, the people of China had been dealing with already since December 2019, but it wasn't officially declared a pandemic until March 13th. And COVID-19 exposed a lot about the world, about how governments react and how systems react to pandemics. And so I wanted to ask you guys about what your thoughts are on how COVID-19 has exposed the superiority of socialism and the decaying nature of capitalism. And again, please feel free to put any comments, topics that you want to discuss. I'm writing them down. You guys have some great topics already that we're going to discuss later on. But yeah, why don't you guys go ahead and share your thoughts about COVID-19 and socialism versus capitalism?
Before answering, I'd say people should go and look at Nick's great article on it, where he highlights, the differences between how socialist countries have responded and stuff. So maybe you're the one to speak on it, Nick.
I think one of the most important things about this whole thing is it's not just a difference between the first and the third world nations. It's more so a difference between the capitalist and the socialist nations. And even in the third world, we see that capitalist nations pursue the same policies, both in the third and first world. Capitalist nations pursue those same neoliberal policies. They try to go about the crisis as business as usual. And clearly, you can't have a for-profit healthcare system during a global pandemic where every single person in the nation is going to be affected by it, regardless of whether they have the money to afford healthcare or not. I think one thing that Marxists understand is whenever there's these crises, whether it be like a recession or a depression, or because along with the COVID crisis came the economic crisis, which we're still in. Whenever these crises come about, the nation is going to try to transfer as much wealth as it can to the top echelons of society, to the richest parts of society, and do so in such a tremendous fashion that we're not even going to be prepared to deal with it. So, we've all seen how much richer Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, all the richest U.S. capitalists have gotten hundreds of billions of dollars richer during this whole pandemic. And it's not just true for the U.S., it's true for every nation. The richest echelons of society have just enriched themselves in order to soften the blow that they're going to take from the pandemic, because they know something bad is going to happen. And but even though they know that, they're not going to prepare the people for it. They're going to prepare themselves for it. Now you contrast that to Cuba and Vietnam and China, and you have nations that have done as much as they can so that the people can take as little impact from as little negative impact from the virus and the crisis as they possibly could. Especially in Cuba. I mean, Cuba's not only helping its own people, but then they're sending doctors across the world to help other nations as well. So you should see the different, I would say, values of socialism versus capitalism. Socialism, you actually have some sort of humanity, some sort of value of human life. Capitalism clearly has no value for human life. I mean, they only value profit. Look at how many people are dying in the U.S. right now. They think we just passed more casualties than World War II.
Damn, I didn't know that. Yeah, and I think the other thing to reiterate, like to highlight, is the central planning and production. Like that was key. Why Vietnam, why China, why Cuba was so quickly able to move industry to say, hey, you're going to make masks now. Hey, you're going to make N95s. I don't care what you were producing before. Like it's so wild to think of that. And there are still N95 shortages in California. Like there's not enough respirators. It's maddening when you think about it that way. And we are like, what's the math? If it's 300 million in the US and it's 1 billion in China, the scale, when you compare, right, like what China was able to produce and do quickly within a matter of weeks, in Wuhan, and then for the rest of the country, and then go out and then help Italy and go out and help all these other countries that, literally thumb their noses down at China or Vietnam. And these were the countries that at the end of the day were turning around and supporting first world imperialist countries, because of the way central planning and socialism works. It works. And I can't think of a better example in modern times to tell people like why it's so important to have a structure like this, to have, the state take take the role and a people's state. This is what we mean when we're talking about a planned economy and centralization, which is, oh my goodness, sorry, this thing keeps falling out. Which is so, what's the word? Like people here, at least in LA, I would say, like have such a visceral response, you know, because they think of the state as the bourgeois state. They think of the state as the US. And it's, anyway, I thought that to me, and the Tricontinental, if y'all follow them, did a great series of dossiers, like just breaking down like what Cuba did, what Vietnam did, what China did. And even like a smaller example of Kerala in India versus the rest of the country, and why they were able to stave off, like, well, they've been a little impacted now because Modi obviously like allowed other people to come into the state. But in the beginning, when the lockdown was happening, Kerala had like superb, you know, treatment. And China obviously is on a different scale, but like Vietnam, Cuba, the Kerala state in India, they're not wealthy, right? It's not like they have tons of GDP or anything like that. But like you were saying, Nick, like the value, but also I would also say like the structures that are there.
Yeah, what do you think, Carlos?
Yeah, what I wanted to say, I live in the UK, and what I wanted to say was, you know, from a third worldist and a communist perspective, you know, this country, the UK, had, you know, their response to it was ridiculous, and you know, it is one of the countries most affected with, I think, even though the population in this country is 60 million, there's like nearly 60,000, or I think over 60,000 people have died of it. And even though it's, you know, it's a first world country, it should have the power to protect its citizens, but obviously they failed because they don't give a shit about the people. But also beyond that, to say that things like, you know, people here have had quite a lot of economic support. Small businesses have been given grants, and individuals have been given benefits and have been furloughed from work, and have had, you know, some of their wages being given to them even though they haven't been at work. And the only reason why they could do that is because they're in an imperialist country that, you know, loots the rest of the world and has the resources to do that, whilst countries like China, Vietnam, Cuba, and so on do similar things off their own backs without having to be parasites to the rest of the world. And that's also something that we need to highlight, that, you know, whatever progressive or progressive seeming policies that they have here is because they're able to do that because of what they do to the global south, whilst you know, socialist countries do it off their own backs.
Yeah, that's a great point. And touching on that, it's someone named It's Colin in the chat asked an interesting question. It said, Ofelia mentioned third worldism. Can you explain it a little bit and defend it against common criticisms? I think that's a great question related to also what Carlos was talking about. How would you all define third worldism, and how do you defend it against critiques made by the traditional or the first world left, that it's, you know, ultra left, or that it's outdated, or, you know, how would you define third worldism?
I'll say one of the most important things that we need to, you know, one of the important differences of third worldism compared to the regular communism is that regular communism is very Eurocentric in that it doesn't take into account that imperialism is an ongoing thing. Imperialism also means that a large part of the working class in the Western world, in the first world, benefit from imperialism. They, you know, it might not be a lot, but they do things like public services like healthcare. Here in the UK, where we get free healthcare and education and so on, it is available to to all of the people, working class and middle class and so on. But it's because these countries loot the rest of the world, and so third worldism recognizes that while classic communism, it kind of leaves it to one side. It neglects it. It at best says it's, or they would say things like, the working class in the Western world are more productive, and that's why they have the level of the system they have and the development that they have, but they don't take into account. Yeah, they basically make a secondary thing that imperialism is the main source of income for these countries.
And I think the revolutionary kind of potential we always say is greater in the third world, and that reverses a lot of traditional, I would say more Eurocentric Marxist-Leninism that says, it's going to come from the more advanced industrious nations, right? Like the first Europe, the US, that this is where the spark for global revolution is going to begin. But we reverse that, right? Because of the very same thing Carlos was explaining, right? Like we believe our energy should really be put towards third world peoples because they literally have the most to lose and nothing to lose but their chains. And I think that's ultimately also where we disagree. And I think one of the biggest criticisms is like, oh, third worlders don't give a shit about what goes on in the US or Europe. And like they hate like, oh, first world is communist. We don't. Like we're not, we'll work with anyone basically. We're not dogmatic in that sense. But I think it's also important that we say like, yeah, prove us wrong. Right? Like if you want to tell me the US is going to start, the revolution that'll lead to global communism, by all means. Historically has never been the case. You know what I mean? Like the biggest revolutions, China, Vietnam, Burkina Faso, Angola, Mozambique, Cuba, like Nicaragua, it's all been the third world, and that's also where we take historical precedent.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Nick, about third worldism?
I agree with Carlos and Ofelia. I think, Che said he had a good quote. I forget directly what it was, but he basically said that he was happy that European and American workers got higher wages in the 70s, or I'm sorry, in the 60s and 50s, but he wanted them to recognize that those higher wages came at the cost of lower wages and more imperialism for the people in Latin America and Asia and Africa. And that's really what third worldism is. It's the benefit of the first world at the expense and at the cost of third world. And, going off of what Ofelia said about us working with groups here, that's not to say that there aren't pockets of the third world here in the first world. And just as there are pockets of the first world in the third world.
Yeah.
Uber rich people who are living off in Latin America who are just crazy wealthy, and same with Africa, same with Asia, and here in the US you have prison populations that are making 10 cents, 20 cents, 30 cents an hour producing goods that are being sold for 10 times more, and you have undocumented immigrant workers who are getting paid under the table that are making significantly less than what minimum wage is. So you have pockets of people here that we do organize and we do work with, and but the point is that these are only pockets, right? In the first world, these are very pockets that are sparsed out and spread across the country, which the U.S. is a big country. Compare that to the third world, you have entire nations, entire communities that are impoverished in horrific ways that have far more revolutionary potential, far more potential for organizing than here in the first world.
Yeah, definitely.
Can I also add that third worldism has a bad rep in the left because there are third worldists that are ultra leftists There are third worlders that are young Westerners who idolize armed struggle, and all other struggles are worthless or not worth fighting. And there are issues within the third worldist kind of community, and the reason and so the left uses those groups, those ultra left third worldist groups, and young white, mostly white, nerdy,
Weird.
white guys, idealists who were kind of weird, and they use them as the sources for third worldism instead of using, serious researchers like Zach Cole, like in Latin America, we have a very strong tradition of third worldist ideology and thought in the dependency theory academics. Marini in Brazil, and several other academics that are very serious, and so the idea of third worldism then through these academics and these serious researchers becomes a real weapon and something that we can use, and so that's why third worldism in the West, especially by obviously the Western left, is always demonized and put to one side, using stupid little kids who have very simplistic takes. So yeah, I would suggest if people want to know about third worldism, to look at the work of people like Zach Cole, of John Smith, who has a book called, I think, Imperialism in the 21st Century. And these are books, and these are authors and books who show you like actual evidence and in economics and in the real world of a labor aristocracy, of the Western working class benefiting from imperialism and therefore making them counter-revolutionary, really, in a lot of places. But again, as I think Nick was saying, there are communities within the first world that do have a revolutionary potential because of these are immigrants, working class Black people, working class Latinos, working class immigrants in general, who do have revolutionary potential, and also even white working class. But yeah, so it doesn't mean that we a lot of the third worldists, the young third worldists that we're referring to, who have a simplistic take, will say that nobody in the West has revolutionary potential and isn't a proper working class. But yeah, we challenge that. That's obviously not our take.
And even some of the classic Marxist-Leninists, like the revolutionaries, you even see them heading in that direction.
Che.
For example, Che Guevara, as y'all mentioned. Read Kim Il-sung. If you read Kim Il-sung from DPRK, it's very third worldist. He talks about the unity of Africa, Asia, Latin America against U.S. imperialism. Lin Biao in China, you talk about Ho Chi Minh. I mean, Ho Chi Minh, his experience in the French Communist Party and seeing how whack they were in terms of anti-colonialism, and being like, yo, these white people do not give a fuck about my people. So why the fuck am I gonna, join their party? Let's liberate Vietnam. And it started out as a quote unquote nationalist movement, but eventually became a Marxist.
The same thing when the Cuban Revolution took power, and they were like, Fidel's a bourgeois nationalist. Right. Yeah. And look at who lived to over his cool 100 years and kept Cuba like a sovereign, wonderful, people state. It's just kind of funny, because when you read those things, it's really affirming, to see and think this isn't new. It's just that we finally put a name to it, and I think that you should check out our articles at Anticonquista too. Carlos has written great pieces. Ramiro has written great pieces on third worldism. So y'all should definitely go and check those out if you're interested as well. And there's a lot of folks in the chat mentioning other great authors as well.
Yeah.
I would also say that, third worldism goes back to Marx. For those who are quite dogmatic on Marx, and who only read Marx and Marx is the final word. go back and read Marx, and he started developing the idea of the labor aristocracy. He didn't extend it to where it is now, of course, because of the time, but he developed the idea of the labor aristocracy, and looked at how English workers, sorry, were being bought off by the bourgeoisie in their country, through giving them benefits, through giving them higher wages. So yeah, it's not a new idea. It's not. It's part of Marxism. It's part of communism.
Yeah.
So another aspect of 2020, there were a lot of protests this year, and it's interesting and important for us to kind of reflect on the nature of these protests and where they went. In the U.S., we had a lot of protests against police brutality and racist killings over the summer, especially in response to George Floyd and other people who were murdered. However, in the fall, we also had a lot of protests in Latin America. We had protests in Chile. We had protests in Colombia. We had protests in Peru, in Guatemala, and Haiti. Why don't you all give us a comparison of where you think your analysis of protests in the first world, tying this in with third worldism, right? The protests in the US, what route they ended up taking, and compare that to the protests in Latin America, like in the countries I mentioned, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Haiti, Guatemala, and just offer your thoughts on that, because I think that also helps to show in real life, like what we mean as third worldists when we say that NGOs and the liberal imperialist establishment is able to co-opt any form of resistance in the first world. So what do you guys think about those two different protests?
Well, I guess I could start. One of the things you see in the protests in Latin America is a lot of the protests are very similar to each other, in that they all have the same demand. That demand is that there was a failure on the part of in most of these places you see neoliberal governments, or in some cases even far right wing, damn near fascist governments, who are basically, as we were talking about before, putting profit over people's lives. And these protests, like we saw in Guatemala against Yamate, they burned down parts of the Congress, and that was a reflection of just how much anger had been built up, not just in 2020, but for the past decade of neoliberal rule in Guatemala, especially of the massacres and atrocities that were being committed by against the indigenous people in that nation, which is a nation of mostly indigenous people, mostly indigenous folks. So, one of the biggest differences that there in those countries, the protesters are clearly not working in line or working in lockstep or hoping for some sort of reform. They want something more than reform. They want a substantial change. In Peru, protesters have forced constitutional changes. They forced the coup. They forced the constitution, or they forced the Congress to stop their coup. They stopped the congressional coup, which was taking place. These people aren't, most of these protesters, they're not working, for some sort of candidate or with the hopes that another candidate would take place, kind of like what we saw here in the U.S., where it was more so a lot of these protests were anti-Trump protests rather than protests for something more significant, right? Because now that we got Trump out of office, we got Biden, and he's basically saying he's not going to do anything that any of the protesters were marching for this whole summer. So, people there are going to force their demands on the government, rather than people here in the first world are not going to force their demands, but are not really going to force anything. They're going to wait for the government to see what the government says, right? Here we react to our government. In the third world, they demand and they act against their government. I would say that's the biggest difference I see.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think also the as you mentioned, the aims goes back to revolutionary potential and understanding that in this country, like, people are looking for reforms and concessions, whereas in our Matria Grande, it's like we're starving. We are getting sick from COVID. We have no land. We can't, raise our children or our families. And I think that, that's something that I think is a marked distinction. Even here, you have hours-long debates on the news about whether or not people should destroy property and, the merits of like anarchism or whatever, however they want to frame it, destruction of public property. In other countries, it's like burn everything. It's not a question. I think that to me is the market difference. And I don't know, but here I don't know. I think that to me is the most evident difference, and also how this brings about, more progressive leadership or like deep rooted changes, whether it's a constitutional referendum or a constituent assembly, which for folks who are on the chat and, other countries actually rewrite their constitutions, right? They don't keep some dusty document that like 12 white dudes wrote 200 years ago. And I think that those kinds of things, right? Like the first world can't even fathom sometimes when they think about their aims, their strategy, their organizing. It's like, let's write a petition to our city council member, or let's go lobby visit.
We're going to hold our elected officials accountable. I'm just like, what do you think, Carlos, about the protests in the first world, US and UK, versus protests in Latin America, specifically Colombia, Chile, Peru, Guatemala, and Haiti?
Yeah, and I would add, I agree with what you guys have said already, and I would add that it's clear to see that when say, for example, there's a protest in Colombia, you see a kind of wave of protests in the rest of the region, or when shit started kicking off in Chile, shit started happening all over the place as well, and it kind of shows that it's a region-wide movement based on fighting capitalism, based on fighting imperialism, things that affects all of the region. And whereas the protests in where we are, as you guys were saying, are so inward looking that they're not really paying attention, apart from the BLM thing, which is different, and there has been a wave in the rest of the Western world on that particular issue. But yeah, in Chile, for example, and I would also say the demographics, the people involved, you'll see that the protest in Chile was started, I think, in late 2019, was because of high school kids who weren't happy about the government raising public transport prices, and so they took over stations, and these are kids. Like, I don't know about what you guys where you are, but kids don't protest where I am. They're like completely not interested, apart from BLM, which has caught on. But in terms of class related things, which affects everybody, it's just something you don't see,
Yeah, for sure. And even the protests, I think what's beautiful about the protest, I think, especially focusing on Latin America, is the centrality of indigenous people in a lot of them. For example, in Guatemala, when they burned the Congress, as you mentioned, Nick, a lot of the head people that were leading these protests, indigenous, especially indigenous women. In Colombia, you have a lot of the people with from the Cauca region, indigenous people. I think Creek, the Minga Indígena, that were energizing a lot of the protests, and indigenous people were so central to that. Peru as well. In Peru, you had a lot of indigenous people. In Chile, Chile is interesting because, like, historically, there's been a division between the white Chilean left and the Mapuche. But what I think was inspiring to see this year was the synthesis of Mapuche protesters heading to cities like Santiago and joining with the urban white working class in Chile to protest together. And so I think it's really cool. And just by the way, before we move on to the other topics, and Thanks again. Shout out to everybody in the chat, by the way, who's watching and listening. Please share this on your social media. Please follow us on social media. I also just want to mention that we as Anticonquista, we have been not only covering these protests and uprisings, but we have been materially supporting groups on the ground that have been participating in uprisings. For example, in Haiti, there's been protests for several years, and we last year were able to donate funds to a grassroots group in Haiti that helps the resistance, that helps provide medical aid, food, nutrition. We also helped raise funds for La Trocha in Colombia, which is helping creating small businesses around a beer business, but they're helping ex-combatants of the FARC to organize and mobilize people who have been totally displaced because of violence there. In Chile, we were able to raise and send $1,500 to the Mapuche people. Ofelia created a great video on that on our social media. You could check that out, where we have our money, the money that you're donating and helping to raise us to send is helping out political prisoners. And soon we're also going to announce some funds that we were able to raise for Ofrane Garifuna communities in Honduras, recovering from hurricanes Eta and Iota because of climate change and capitalism. Moving a little forward, we had some interesting questions from some of the comrades who are listening and watching. What do you guys think about, I think this is one that's kind of interesting, the elections in Venezuela. Rodrigo asked about elections in Venezuela. What do you think about the PSUV's victory? And also, what do you think about the division between the Communist Party of Venezuela and the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, and attempts to divide the left in the country? And one last thing, what advice would you give to Maduro and the PSUV now that they won the election, moving forward in terms of continuing to build the revolution?
I would start off by saying that, you know, we Anticonquista, Ramiro, Ofelia, we have first-hand experience of working with the Venezuelan. We worked for Telesur English at one point a few years ago, and so we've seen firsthand how, you know, some things are handled, and you know, we obviously support Maduro, we support the socialist government, but we do have criticisms. We you know, we need to move forward. We need to develop the revolution and get rid of some factions within who are bureaucratic, who are careerists, who aren't socialist. And so I think, you know, one of the things that Maduro and Maduro's people, especially obviously the socialists and the socialists, what they need to do is start, you know, filtering out finding out who's really with the revolution and who's here because they're getting paid, and that makes a lot of difference. And by doing that, by default, they will be stretching their hands to the more radical sectors of Venezuelan society and the more radical parties like Communist Party and so on. The revolution in Venezuela does need to do something about getting rid of the bureaucrats and careerists and becoming more radical, more having more links and a closer relationship with the communists and the socialists.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Nick?
Well, first, I think, you know, there's no one who is above criticism, and there's no one who's above, you know, criticism or self-criticism. That's one of the main tenets of socialist and communist ideology, especially, you know, developed from now. So, you know, you got to understand that there's always going to be things that are good and bad for every leader in every nation. I think insofar as the Communist Party of Venezuela are actually true to what they say and actually do want to fight for the people and defend the people, then we're going to see that reflected in, it should be seen and should be reflected in their organizing and in the base that they can build. And if they can build enough base, because what they say is actually reaching the people of Venezuela and actually having a big impact, then you'll see that reflected in the electoral politics. So, I think this year was kind of hard to tell because they broke off from the PSUV like 6 months ago. It wasn't that long ago. They didn't really have much time to build a base. So the elections, they had very minor gains. But I think I read some of their documents and what they published when they first broke off, and they had legitimate concerns about the still present and still existing bourgeois sectors of society that had not been rooted out by Maduro. And this is something I think we at Anticonquista talked about like years ago, that there's still existing sections of bourgeois there's still existing bourgeois classes and bourgeois members in Venezuela that need to be rooted out if we want to progress the revolution. So I think insofar as they want to do that and they have popular support, then we'll see that. Now, if that's not their goal, and their goal is more so to be sectarian and to cause chaos, then we'll see that reflected in low popularity, Venezuelan people not going behind them, and the PSUV will continue to do well. But in terms of what we still need to fight here in the diaspora, it's still the U.S. sanctions and U.S. imperialism. Even the left that broke off from the PSUV still admits and still acknowledges that U.S. imperialism is one of the main problems that Venezuela is going through right now. And so that's, I think that's what we will have to focus on in our own organizing. Any change that will happen in Venezuela will come about from the Venezuelan people themselves. They'll get to decide which way they want to go.
That's an excellent point, Comrade Nick, that, we can comment, but at the end of the day, we have to respect the Venezuelan people and in their struggle. And exactly what you say, what we need to focus on as the diaspora, and what we encourage the left and the Western world to do is stop meddling in our people's affairs and simply support us, because we need anti-imperialist support. We can comment on it, but at the end of the day, is their choice.
Yeah, we're not on the ground as well as doing anything, and it's kind of hard for us to go there and push some external belief on people.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, honestly. I think.
Yeah,
I feel you covered it.
Yeah, I feel like everything y'all said is on point. And at the end of the day, even like Chavez said, right? Unidad, unidad, unidad. And the goal should always be to, obviously, we critique and debate any reactionary views. And then, unfortunately, in the PSUV, there's a lot of, some reactionary stuff and some counter-revolutionary liberal people who are there. But unity should always be the goal, to unite the masses around a socialist revolution for the people. Moving on to some of the other stuff from this year, we saw in Argentina, there was a big uprising for the legalization of abortion, and also the death of Maradona. I don't know if y'all have any comments on either of those two things.
I think it just passed, didn't it? Mm-hmm. After was it yesterday or the day before that? I can't remember. It might have been Friday. But I think it just shows what we mentioned previously, right? Like when protests happen in Latin America, it has a clear aim. And I think obviously this is a movement that it didn't start yesterday, but it's been consistent and led to a taking up of a lot of the same branding and across Latin America, right? Like el pañuelo verde, right? Like the green bandana, has come to symbolize reproductive rights, women's rights, LGBTQ folks, so it's something that, I think reiterates some of the things we've already shared. Like Carlos was saying, when it happens in one country, it tends to kind of pick up and also speak towards Latin American and Caribbean unity, which we know because of shared histories across the area. There's always been an idea of united socialist states of Latin America. And I think that protest in particular, or that movement rather, which brings people from all walks of life. I think speaks more to like how things don't necessarily explicitly have to be socialist or communist or whatever, but they can still, in what they're doing, produce communism and socialism. So, and I think that happens a lot in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's something we were having a conversation about before this stream. We have an editors call once a month, so we're kind of talking about that. Carlos was mentioning that, and it's
Yeah. What do you guys think about Maradona's passing, Diego Armando Maradona, and also the legalization of abortion in Argentina?
Well, I guess briefly on the legalization of abortion, for a region which has been predominantly dominated by Catholicism, and whose traditions have, like Catholic traditions and Christian traditions, have been overwhelmingly predominant in our culture and society, it's good to see that there's significant change and push to change those traditions and to be more progressive, because it's like Ofelia was saying, it's like a step in the right direction. It may not be explicitly socialist or communist, but in a socialist society, in a communist society, that's what we would want. Equal access to reproductive rights.
Yeah. What about you, Carlos? Anything on Maradona or the fight for abortion rights?
Yeah, I think what I would say on Maradona's passing is, it caused a lot of, Latin Americans and the whole world remembered Maradona for his football, and for us who are on the left, we remember him because of what he represented to the left. This famous footballer who made it and who had millions, but who never betrayed his working class roots and his working class interests. I think that we also have to, when we bring up Maradona, we don't want to idolize people. I think is that what I think what our stance should be. We shouldn't idolize people and act as if they were saints, and we always have to highlight the fact that he had a troubled life too. He was an addict, and crucially, something that needs to be spoken about is that he was accused of domestic violence. And so, these are personalities, characters in our culture as Latin Americans who, we should look into and study and see what they did, and not necessarily idolize them. In my opinion, it's a bit like our take. I'll say my take on Simón Bolívar, who is a symbolic figure for Latin America. He represents independence, anti-imperialism, and so on. But in our opinion, looking at it with a closer historical angle, there's a lot of problematic things in the history of Simón Bolívar and the independence movement. So yeah, it's just about understanding those personalities and as a whole, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. Cool, comrades. So we have about 10 minutes left. Shout out to everybody who's been on here, by the way. Shout out to Orlando. Shout out to Rodrigo, to Camilo, everybody who's been following and sharing this. Just to kind of wrap up our last few minutes on the stream, why don't we talk a little bit about our view, our outlook for next year? What do you think are some things that we should keep an eye out for in 2021, whether it's elections or protests or anything coming up? And what's something also that you want to highlight in general for Anticonquista, or any work that you're involved in that we can share with the audience? I'll just quickly mention from the get. Someone asked in the chat. I'm asking this because someone asked in the chat. Could we get a glimpse into your perspective? What are some of your strategic goals for Anticonquista 2021 lessons, and what is there to learn for next year? And I think that's a great question, and I kind of want to follow on that pattern as we close off. I think for Anticonquista, and someone also asked earlier, how can we get involved? Email us, info@Anticonquista. ANTICONQUISTA.org. We're always looking for submissions for content. We're trying to grow and mobilize our communities, our diasporas to unite, to fight against capitalism and imperialism. I think I'm just want to give a shout out to all of our fellow co-editors here for putting in work throughout the year, to all of our patrons, patreon.com/ANTICONQUISTA. All those funds go back directly to our people. We've been working, man, all year. We've been working hard. We've all been working on our own projects, collaborating, win-win cooperation. And next year, we want to continue growing. We want to get to the point where people can no longer have to depend on Univision and Telemundo and all these liberal whack ID poll Latino sites for their politics. Like, we're organizing and mobilizing our people, our diaspora. And for next year, there's going to be a few elections next year. In Honduras, there's going to be an election as well. I'm definitely sure there's going to be some big protests around that. There's going to be elections in other countries as well. In Nicaragua, we're going to expect to see more of that color revolution style opposition. Biden's going to be in, they're going to try this whole soft coup, soft power approach. That's what I think for next year. And we got to be ready for that as well. And that's why we've been year after year building content, creating content. But what do you guys all think about, reflecting on this year and things to look out for next year?
This year will also be big for Mexico. They'll have, or what AMLO proposed when he became president, which was to have a midterm plebiscite or referendum on his position, right? So the Mexican people would go and, alongside the congressional elections, literally cast their vote on whether AMLO is doing a good job as president. And the idea is that if they were like, nah, he would step down. Mexico has 6-year presidential terms, and you can only have one. So this would be basically a check on what has been a sordid elected office in Mexico for a very long time. And he's also proposing that the Mexican government have the capacity to prosecute former presidents. So there's like a lot that he's bringing to the table next year. It'll also be a good time of distance to look back and see how many of his campaign promises he's been able to keep. Lucho, who's a colleague and friend of ours, who's down in Mexico City, did a great podcast with Ramiro talking about AMLO. I believe it was in 2019. But anyway, like, this is kind of like the midpoint, right, of his election. Well, it'll be at the end of 2021. But, we're getting to the halfway point of his term, his mandate, along with the election in Nicaragua, in Honduras, like, those things will be, sorry, no, Honduras was it. No, yeah. Honduras and Nicaragua, 2 crucial places in Central America. So I think that kind of like some of what we had last year and a bit of this year for South America, where major elections happened, we're moving a little more north this time. And I think that's, that'll be interesting to see just how it plays out with COVID and everything.
Yeah. What do you guys think, Carlos and Nick, just recapping what you think for this year, what you want to see ANTICONQUISTA grow to, and also what our community, what our people should look out for next year in terms of like imperialism, capitalism, or uprisings?
I hate to sound like a broken record because I keep saying the same thing, but ANTICONQUISTA has really been, for the Latin American diaspora, I think, leading an example in how to adapt, struggle, and one of those ways has been us raising funds. Everything we do in terms of content creation and all of that is all geared towards collecting funds so that we can send back home. And I think that development right there is what we're kind of perfecting more and more as the years go by. More and more this last year, perfecting, how we collect those funds, and so the evidence of that is in what Ramiro said earlier on, the organizations that we funded throughout the region, but also in the creation of our sister organization, Red Condor Collective, and the fact that we raised in the matter of a month, we raised £3,000, 3,000 and something pound, which is I think something like $4,000. and this was in the midst of the Colombian protests. So, and those funds that were then sent to JUCO, Juventud Comunista in Colombia. It was sent to a group called Ciudad Movimiento, which is it's linked to Congreso de los Pueblos, and we also funded guerrilla fighters, FARC guerrilla fighters who marched towards Bogota to denounce the government's lack of support, as well as the killings of their comrades, nearly 300 of them. And so in this next year that's coming, we want to keep doing the same thing. We need people to help us. If you can't help us in terms of our Patreons, help us in terms of manpower, woman power, creating content with your skills, production skills, producing videos, that kind of thing, producing posters. If people have those kind of skills, then definitely contact us because we need it. Anticonquista, Red Condor Collective, we need those kind of skills, and again, all of that is geared towards, we're not activists for the sake of being activists, and we're not providing information for the sake of providing information alone. All of this is geared towards having some kind of tangible impact on the front lines in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with what everyone said so far. I mean, this year has been it's been a lot. I think there's a lot we can pull out from this year. I think we're still going to have to keep going over this because there's a lot of lessons to be learned for Anticonquista and for really any movement that seeks to go forward from here on out. As Anticonquista, I think we did a great job at really expanding our base and making it really bringing in more people, bringing in more connections. Really tying together the diaspora, working with different groups, working with not just here in the U.S. or in the U.K., but also throughout Latin America. What I'm hoping for in the future is, and what I've seen that's been pretty good is, since 2020 has been happening, I've noticed more and more young people want to get involved. People around my age, people a little bit older, they want to get more involved. They want to be part of something. They want to do something. And you see this in. Since the pandemic started, a bunch of mutual aid groups popped up, and a lot of these mutual aid groups are made up by young people. So I think, and I've been working with some of them here myself, and it's good to see that there is energy out there, energy that wants to make a difference, a positive energy, and if we can do more of our work, which is really our work revolves a lot around education. And educating people about current topics, past topics. If we can keep doing that, then this energy will be brought into the socialist movement, and we can really make a better world, not just here, but throughout the world. So that's what I'm hoping for in the future, especially with Anticonquista and with all the groups that we're working with now.
Yeah, definitely.
Well said.
Orlando had a great comment. He said, when the pandemic subsides, we should have a meetup in major cities. Yo, that's #1 on our agenda. We're trying to have events out there in London with Carlos, in Newark with Nick, in New York, Newark. Shout out to Newark. Out here in Cali with Ofelia in LA. And so, shout out to everybody on this chat. Thank you all for joining us.
I was gonna say I'm so sorry because I was laughing at some point when y'all were talking because someone in the fucking chat just said all the dreams have the same mustache, and then somebody else responded, "Yeah, you had to grow it if you're a co-editor."
You have Latino mustache.
I was dying
The Latino dad mustache. I'm gonna shave this off to make it legit.
Oh my god!
Yo, y'all are mad funny. Yo, shout out to everybody in the chat. By the way, there's some names. Y'all are fucking hilarious and awesome. Orlando, Diego, Bone Dance. Follow us, Anticonquista, Facebook, IG, Twitter.
Yeah, we'd like to at some point have meetups. I know we've talked about it and stuff like that. So, I mean, hopefully, obviously not maybe like 2022. I don't know.
We'll see what's good. But yo, comrades, it was great talking to y'all. Happy holidays. Enjoy your holiday season. 2021, La Lucha Sigue. We're going to be continuing to be fighting imperialism, capitalism, fighting for our people, fighting for the liberation of Latin America and the Caribbean. Shout out to